Значит, я почему постарался выйти немножко за рамки текущих событий, потому что сейчас понятно.
What is the reason why I have decided to depart from this relevant topic of current affairs? So we know that Russia had the Duma elections last year, and will go through presidential elections in a matter of a year or 2 years. But there are more in-depth things than, of course, the current affairs. And when you work with a particular audience, you have to be prepared to take and analyze the Russian society in a wider context. What is the Russian society? How and if will it embrace modernization, or is it an archaic society which is quite hopeless in terms of modernity? So what is modernization, in my view? There are many definitions, but what I would have decided to pick up for myself is that whereas traditional societies are based on authority, traditions related to ancestry, ideology, and a society which is mostly consists of integrist type people, and whereas this system of views is deprived of one of its bricks, then the entire system starts to crumble. So such integral approach is important to some people. On the other hand, modernization of a society leads to a situation whereby a person reserves the right to make a choice, the right to try and construct his or her worldview or develop it. Such a worldview depends on ideology. It also depends on the family background, on the surrounding society, but of course the final decision is taken by the individual himself or herself. Let me continue with the thought proposed by Lena, when she said that such a modernist view of the world is not compatible with fanaticism. It provides room for doubt and for choice. Clearly, there are values which cannot be treated with irony, but such values cannot be such untouchable values, if I may say so, cannot be infinite. If you take everything around you without irony, and if you do not have any doubts, then this is, of course, a classical archaic approach. If we try to analyze the contemporary Russian society, I dare say that it did not much depart from the Soviet society. But what was the Soviet society? Of course, the economy moved away from the Soviet period, and even though the state still runs a lot of enterprises, it is still a different economy. It is still a different system of relations in the economy compared to the Soviet days. The information picture has also changed drastically. And when some people say that we're going back to the Soviet Union, I think that this is a wild exaggeration. We are certainly not moving back to the Soviet days, but we're rather moving towards something that we may call soft authoritarian regimes, but certainly not totalitarianism or else ideological dictatorship as we had in the Soviet days. But when we But with that being said, humans, individuals, do not change much. 20 years after the October events of 1917, 20 years later, around 1937, it turned out during a sociological census and sociological poll, it turned out that the Soviet people were in their majority believers. In the majority of those who went through census in 1937 said that they had faith in God. And this after 20 years of Bolshevist rule. Well, this is certainly one of the reasons why the results of the census of 1937 were classified, and those who were preparing this census were physically exterminated. As in a matter of several years, in a couple of years, another census was conducted, which had produced results more in line with the so-called general line of the party. Why am I saying this? A human changes, or an individual changes a lot slower than the world around him. What was the demand of those people who went to the free elections of 1990? This demand, the social demand, was quite complicated. These Soviet people in 1990 were those who had already gone through the Soviet modernization, or even two waves of Soviet modernization. And the first one was an absolute sadistic industrialization or collectivization of the first half of the 20th century, repressions. But this was indeed how the new society was being created. Like it or not, this is what led the Bolsheviks to resolve the questions posed by the Russian society, something that the Tsarist government did not do. The Tsarist government could not solve the problem of education. And there was a great disbalance in Russia between the industrialization of the country of the second half of the 19th century and the politics of Pobyedonostsov, oriented towards the classified approach to education. The problem of economic modernization was also not resolved. So it is not surprising that the Bolsheviks were those who brought the textbooks to the Russian villages. And the Bolsheviks brought to the Russian villages what they called the electricity, the so-called little lamp of Ilyich, of Lenin. And the second stage of the Soviet modernization was the post-Stalin period, and especially in the years of the so-called Brezhnev oil boom, when the very interesting processes were underway in the Soviet Union, when people were gradually getting their private residences, and the so-called communal apartments were dwindling in numbers. And of course, the attention towards the privacy and the private life was becoming more integrated in the late Soviet culture. It is interesting to note the episode of the Carnival and Night feature film of 1957, when this was probably the first instance in the Soviet history when the art was humanized. This film has interesting connotations. I shall not be dwelling on them in the ambit of this lecture, but in this film and in the works of this period, we're witnessing for the first time a new wave in the Russian culture of the Soviet period. Big chunks of the Soviet history were under taboo. However, the forbidden fruit was ever more precious, and so there was a great interest towards history surging in the Soviet Union in the 1970s, including the interest towards the works of Solovyov. And of course, there was a great interest towards the works of Solovyov, Kluchevsky, and other historians. 1989, what did Soviet people want? They wanted something which could hardly be preserved, such as the preservation of some Soviet fundamentals, including free medicine, free healthcare, and free education, and an important adjustment to the entire Soviet system. So it was a moderately reformer penchant, if I may call it so. So what they wanted is a more humanized economic model.
As usual, there is much mythology in societies linked to economy. They wanted to keep in place the Swedish model, socialism, but of a different sort, different kind, not the one. But they didn't want to say no to the results. And the question is that they had this demand when in Sweden already they were experiencing a serious crisis. But the Soviet society did not think much about it. What else did they want? They wanted less state intervention into public life, so the matters of private life should not be discussed at trade union meetings and party members' meeting. What else was desired? And limited amounts private property. And this was based when people would, say, travel to the Warsaw Pact countries, and they would tell each other that, look, in Hungary and GDR, and the countries are very much unlike one another. Hungary was substantially a much freer country than elsewhere. That these countries have private property, small businesses, people who start their shops and whatever. It's for good reason that this movement of cooperatives, it all started in these ideas. Okay, let us assume these functions with the state cannot cope with because it's too much, selfish. There was demand for fighting what was known as the privilege or perks, privileges of free benefits and perks of the party nomenclature, and there was also great demand to adjust and correct the ideology. And at this is where huge interest for history led to the fact that they sought for analogies in history, was often as a case ready-made solutions. What needed to be done in other cases, they wanted to search in history, and certainly rejection of official atheism. Soviet people were formed and shaped as atheists in high school, but the topic of atheism was probably one of the most vulnerable spots in soft spots of the vulnerable spots in Soviet ideology. And even the people who overall were Soviet in their mentality, many of them thought that atheism is probably a bit too much, that the Soviet ideology could not really give answers to any real questions that were in people's minds. The question about what is the point and sense, what is the goal of our life, and what sense can we make of our life, and what happens after we die. Religion, yes, is the meaning of life, and the religion provides time-tested answers to these questions. So you can look at this demand as a purely modernistic demand with pretty serious traditionalist elements in it. And if we look at what we see now, this very serious disappointment in liberalism as well as democracy has to do with the fact that this demand was either never met, for example, about the context of privileges or perks, or was met but not in the way people wanted. And if we look back from the perspective of 1989 onto our modern life, then what our life is today, then modern ideas and notions about what is right, what is wrong, what is it that we must do, they are very sophisticated. And they include, indeed, elements of construction. A person do not stick to a single ideology. And they seem to consider these things within the norm, within what was considered to be the norm, the rule in Soviet times, but not the officialdom, no, where they promoted communist ideology, internationalism, atheism, you name it. No, what was considered to be a rule or norm at the time, something alternative, which certainly included certain elements of Soviet ideology and practice, as well as this set of unmet demands that later were demanded and were in part met and in part never met in the late 1980s. I did not want to create a full presentation. I'll just quote you some figures. I'll just quote Levada Center findings, which I think adequately reflect these processes in the public, and they seek to analyze this. The topic of a great power. We can see that it has been 15 years, and the main attribute of the great power is high living standard of its citizens. Well, which means that people are not prepared to tighten their belts for the ideology or for other purposes, goals. At the same time, we can see that we see sharp rise in the importance of military power and the nuclear weapons. It's the highest rise that we see. And it's the plummeting need is the one that plummeted is the respect for other countries. Respect of other countries towards us. Surely you see clear disappointment in soft power and clear wish for saber rattling. But if we look at other public opinion polls, we would see that this declaration may be present for the state, for the country, but once people start speaking about their own personal choice, what they want to live, what they want their life to be, their family, their near and dear, they start a very different discourse. What do you want your child to be? An officer. Yes, it has grown. As in 2014, 2015, as you can see now, At the time when the society wants to do saber rattling, only 11% want their kids to be officers. Who do they want to be? Physician? Remarkable. But not a teacher. Why? Because physician can make money. He can have private practice. Lawyer, economist, financier, even to a great extent. But we've seen some decline in the prestige and popularity of these professions because we get overproduction and we see very many unemployed lawyers and economists. Diploma doesn't guarantee that tomorrow you will become a CEO of a commercial bank or would ever become. But still, it ranks as number 2, then entrepreneur. And interestingly, that the last, it is a priest. We shall now discuss religious aspects of the life of this society. But given that people traditionally recognize the role of the Church, Orthodox Church, when you speak about what is nearest to you, they don't want their child to be a priest. Even less than they would want him to be an officer, because an officer can be, killed. Priest may have other problems. Either you may remain just never get family if you become one of the black clergy, that is a monk, or quite the opposite, you will have a big family, you can't use contraceptives if you're in white clergy. And it's not really something you can count on. Not a job that would guarantee you. And it's not what matters is declarations, it is what matters for people in their family. What qualities would you like to raise in your children, which you think are most important? And this is where we see there are such qualities as an ability to reach one's goals, to speak to know how to communicate with people, good manners. It's important for self-presentation, for one's career, success. Aspiration for success, yes, it has slightly gone up, but it's not really that high. Whatever we see before that, in the first top 3, it's not really customary within Russia to say, I crave success, but in the first 3, they are actually about success, but the word success is never used. So, certain collectivist attitudes in society and attitudes that they have to do with some private life, intimate life matters. They diverge. While collective are more traditionalist, and this is where we see pretty serious modernist element. Religion, what role does it play? In point of fact, for religious people, this is very sad slide. But this is the case. It's interesting that the number of people who think that religion doesn't play a great role, that they have an idealistic idea about the church, an idea we are absolutely a secular society. We shall see yet another a piece of evidence to support that, and it is a society that doesn't want to conflict. People are discontent when girls go to dance in the church, but when the church goes beyond this sacred space and takes more and more place in their room in their life, people do not think it's very welcome. Well, now an example, for example, right now a discussion about the school, whether we should have religious knowledge taught in schools, and we see that the church that we need to resume teaching religious instruction. People are not really supportive of that. Mostly they think that no religion, the position that France has kept for over 100 years, and 61% think that we should speak about morality, about history, as an optional elective course. a lot of qualifications and a position that excludes. And it's clearly that we can not expect that scripture knowledge would be taught in schools. If we come back to, let's go back to Soviet times, we will see that some things were permitted and others were banned. A system of sections and bans was in place, and the idea that what is good and what is bad, it's pretty Soviet-like, sort of. It hasn't really changed much. For example, the topic of abortions. Again, Orthodox religious position is now upkept by the very few people, and it should be an absolute ban. The majority think that it is either we should see no limitations on that, or there should be in place, but a woman's fundamental right to abortion is recognized by those people. We have seen somewhat an increase in we have seen a considerable increase in those who want to be for limitations, in others who were unqualified, sort of support for this method. But it's interesting why that is the case, because it's something familiar to you. The quite liberal policy about abortions was in place in Soviet times since the mid-1950s, after Stalin's death. Under Stalin, the anti-abortion legislation was in place. This is where the position was pretty liberal, and it took root. People got accustomed to that. Whether it is for the better, whether it is for the worse, it's a different story, but nevertheless. So the attitude towards abortions among the societies, I would say we are an ultra-liberal society here. In some 17 years, there were 2/3. Should the state take measures to prevent abortion? Well, disallow abortion, to prevent abortion. 2/3 say that it's something that it is purely in private life and the state should not intervene here. And this is people who think unlikewise. This is what in Soviet society was never, and it was really criminally punished by criminal law. And again, we see a certain time of public people who only 13% would want to go back to the Soviet morality. We've seen softening of the manners. And people are not really keen to punish for what is known in Russia as non-traditional sexual orientation. But the majority of society refuses those people the right to be normal. Abortions are a norm, a rule, but non-traditional sexual orientation is not. People find other ways. The most is just to suggest that they should be referred to a physician, something that would, in modern Western society, would make people recollect the times of the Inquisition. We here know the story. We are now in UK. In UK, they have a well-known case of innovator and mathematician Turing, he was referred to medical therapy and he committed suicide. But in this case, surely people, their motives are driven by good intentions, but we perfectly know that good intentions do not necessarily take you to paradise. Speaking about propaganda, well, only 14% are to a certain extent tolerant about propaganda. The differences in these figures are that if the society is willing to recognize the right to private life, like it was the case in 1989, when the society did not want trade union committee to discuss their private life matters, who divorced who and who has cohabitation with somebody else. People are reluctant to discuss it in public, matters pertaining to private life. But when we speak about public sphere, we see that things are pretty negative. I would say they're very negative. What's interesting that Another important point is whether the parents of a teenager, do they have the right to punish him? It's well known that in Soviet time, official pedagogic said it was absolute no-no, whereas corporal punishment was a no. However, in households it was actively used, and we can see that nowadays the society in this respect is divided. We see a great number of those who think it's possible in some cases, but the majority would not feel like it. Again, we see that the society is reluctant to go back to archaic norms. And the lowest recent rating, the findings are not Levada centers. They are findings from public opinion surveys that were not representative, were not science-based. They were last TV surveys in UK, France, and Russia. And what we can see is that given that the society, as I was saying, has got a traditionalist as well as modernist element, but if we say who is somebody who would be a role model, we are far more traditionalist than the European countries. We practically don't have any modern role models. Our role models are related to a strong and great state, and a state, amongst other things, that would kill its own citizens, exploits them, and that it should expand its territory. And if we look at England, or rather UK, they do find some symbiosis between their traditions and a more modernistic approach. Well, it's surprising that runner-up to Churchill is Brunel. His name would rather not say much anything to people beyond UK. He was a builder of bridges, tunnels, in railroad construction. Here, actually, a monument to Brunel is at the Paddington railway station. And Princess Diana is there. The French would much rather bet upon culture. Bourvil, Molière, Edith Piaf, Coluche, and classic French culture, Molière, and three actors of the 20th century. To this great extent, it is in line not only with national, special, specific features, but also national stereotypes. And this is where we see here sort of state etatist or and sort of aspiration for statist approach. Very few researchers and scientists, if you look at modern culture, even if you look at modernity as the 20th century, they're not there. There are some characters from a classical school book. No more than that. Well, if we want to sum up, I believe that in the Russian society there is a presence of both traditionalist as well as modernist elements. And the example of the Soviet society has shown that these modernist societies can be grown, that they can develop. And it probably means that the situation is not that hopeless as people think. There's people who think that if it didn't work, it will never work. It means we need to carry on working, and we need to. At that, I suppose I would like to stop my presentation.